Good afternoon, Pnawn everyone. I will just start the process of doing some housekeeping as people continue to join us because I know we've got a fair bit to go through with you today. Um, my name is Stefan Evans, and I'm the new CEO at the Bevan Foundation. Just to give a quick visual description of myself, I am a man in his early to mid 30s, got some glasses and wearing a yellow jumper today. Um, in terms of a bit of housekeeping before I go on to talk about us and this work, this is set up as a Zoom webinar, so your cameras and mics are automatically set to be off. You can communicate with us, so you can send questions in by using the Q&A button. So we'd ask any questions. Feel free to type them in at any time, and there will be plenty of time for discussion. But please use the Q&A box rather than the chat box because it just makes it easier for us to follow those questions as they come in. Um, for those of you who are not familiar with the Bevan Foundation, we are Wales's most influential think tank, and we work on solutions and ideas around solving poverty and inequality in Wales. Um, Now, the area that we're talking to you about today is a new area of work for us as a foundation. We've worked on issues around poverty for quite some time now, but kind of a direct focus on transport and the transition from kind of the role of net zero and the impact of that potentially on poverty is an area of work that we've started working on over the course of 2025. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Joel Davis, who's been leading on our work on this and is the person who's kind of drafted up the report that we've launched today, but is available on our website. But Joel is going to talk you through a little bit about the key findings. We'll then have some time for some questions. But as I said, feel free to pop them in the in the Q&A box as we go, and we'll have time to pick them up at the end. So, Joel.
Thanks, Stefan, and thanks everyone for coming along to this. My name's Joel Davis. I'm a Policy and Research Officer at the Bevan Foundation. And just while Stefan's getting the slides up, I'll just describe myself. So I'm a white man in my 30s, got short brown hair and wearing a check shirt today. So I've been heading up our research into the links between work on net zero transport in Wales and poverty, along with Stefan. And I'm going to take you through a lowdown of the findings of our report today. So as Stefan said, it's our first sort of foray directly into this net zero space, and we think it's going to be a really important issue in lots of sectors. But given some of the major plans around transport, we think it's really important, and this is our starting point. So it's not going to be exhaustive. The report is a big piece of work, and you'll find lots more detail if you give it a read, but hopefully this will give you a flavour of the main findings and the points we're raising. So just to kick us off then, if you go on to the next slide, Stefan. I'll go through a bit of the context and background to the work, let you know how we've gone about it. I'll run through our key findings, including why transport matters, both to net zero goals, but also people living in poverty. A bit about our findings on the opportunities and risks these developments could hold for people on low incomes. And then finally, I'll take you through the recommendations that we've developed to make sure that transport policy works to tackle poverty in the coming years. So if you go on to the next slide and the next one again. So yeah, just quickly, this project is funded as part of our ongoing partnership with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and our key driving question for the work was to identify the benefits and harms that decarbonising Wales's transport system could hold for people on low incomes. So on the next slide, why transport and net zero? So this has been prompted by concerns that we have around the need to reduce emissions on the one side and the urgent need to make progress tackling poverty in Wales on the other. So from what we know, very simply, Wales has legislated to meet a net zero emissions target by 2050, and transport is really increasingly going to have to play its part. So transport makes up 17% of all emissions in Wales, and recent advice from the statutory advisory body for the Welsh Government, which is the Climate Change Committee, is that the Welsh Government really needs to make significant and accelerating progress on decarbonising transport, starting now and over the next couple of decades. And it has said that many of the key near-term actions needed to reduce emissions need to be in the transport sector. On the other side, poverty is stuck at high levels in Wales. 22% of people are in poverty in Wales, and there's been no real progress on this in 20 years. We know that the cost of living crisis is making hardship worse, and actually poverty is deepening. So almost half, 47% of people in poverty in Wales are actually in very deep poverty. That's where household income is less than 40% of the median average. And this has steadily increased since the late 90s. We're looking at projections now that child poverty in particular could increase by around 3 percentage points to 34% of all children in Wales by 2029. And we know from our other research that transport is likely to be a big contributor to poverty. So our snapshot of poverty reports have had a pretty consistent finding over a number of years that around 1 in 8 people in Wales regularly miss out on essential journeys due to cost of living pressures. So we wanted to bring these two areas together to see what effect transport policies might have on levels of hardship in Wales. So if you can move on to the next slide, please, Stefan. So how do we go about the work? Just very quickly, we drew on a significant review of research and policy documents to inform the report. We also engaged with stakeholders working in the transport space, hosting a roundtable discussion, and we had a number of further one-to-one discussions with people. And then a lot of the data in the report is coming from a survey of Welsh adults that we commissioned YouGov to carry out for us. Next slide, please. So in terms of the survey, it posed a wide-ranging set of questions around people's travel habits and experiences, and it's allowed us to look at breakdowns in terms of income as well. So we have a rough kind of threshold of low income at less than £20,000 a year by household. We're able to look at rurality and disability and age and so on. It was carried out in May this year with a sample of over 1,200 people, aged 16 plus. And really importantly, the results are weighted by YouGov, so we can be confident that it's representative of the wider Welsh population. So next slide. Next slide again. So moving on to our findings, we've had a deep dive look at why transport matters, and starting with why transport matters to emissions targets. You can see on the chart on the right here that the makeup of emissions has changed over time in Wales by sector. And that starts to give us an indication of why transport is so crucial a sector, and particularly in recent years and into the future. So until now, we've seen big emissions reductions in areas like electricity generation and waste. These are areas which primarily require activity and change by governments and industry, not so much directly into people's lives. But now that that progress has been made, transport's beginning to represent a much larger proportion of emissions. So it's now contributing 17% of all Welsh emissions, as I said, and it's the second highest emitting sector. And this, again, mostly from surface transport, so road and rail. And the pathway that the Welsh Government is sticking with in terms of its emissions reduction sees almost a fifth of emissions reductions coming from transport between now and 2030, increasing to 27% in the first half of the next decade. And actually, transport emissions reductions have been pretty minimal in Wales up to now. So in the last 10 years or so, they've made up about 1.4% of all emissions reductions. So the progress really needs to ramp up. And broadly speaking, there are three main ways that the Welsh Government could support reductions in transport emissions. So supporting the transition to electric vehicles. They can encourage modal shift by shifting travel habits from polluting cars to public transport and active travel, so walking and wheeling. And then they can also reduce the need for travel. So things like encouraging home working or making sure that services are available online or closer to where people live. So next slide, please. So why does transport matter to people on low incomes? The first thing is that the evidence shows really strongly that people in poverty are generally less mobile. So they spend less on transport as a proportion of household expenditure than people on higher incomes. And that lower mobility isn't just about reduced needs. It's actually primarily about the constraints on mobility that are caused by our transport system, which leads to people missing out on essentials, opportunities for work, and social and leisure activities, things that many people take for granted. So when we asked people in our survey if they had missed out on different types of journeys in the 3 months to May 2025 due to transport or vehicle issues, the most common answers were seeing family and friends. So that 12% of people said that. buying groceries or shopping, 11%, getting to work, 9%, and even attending medical appointments, 6%. Um, we found that even if people on low incomes have cars, they're much less likely to have access to more than one car in their household. So while 44% of people with a higher income, household income of more than £20,000 a year, have access to two or more cars in their household, that's the case for just 15% of people with lower household income. And that clearly reduces the amount of transport flexibility that people on low income have. The chart on the right shows the reasons that people give for not being able to make essential journeys. So the cost of transport and inadequate public transport are issues for significant proportions of adults across Wales. And on the next slide, as well as missing out on journeys and opportunities, transport issues also push people into deeper financial hardship. So for people who are reliant on public transport to get around, we found that over 1 in 5 people, 22% with a low household income, say they're unable to afford fares for public transport, at least occasionally, while 7% say that they can't afford them most of the time or all of the time. And that's more than double the rate found for people in the higher income group. Where people do own a car, low-income householders are much more likely to say that their vehicle related expenses are difficult for them to afford. So if you look at the chart on the right of this slide, you can see that more than 4 times the proportion of people in households earning less than that £20,000 threshold say that these costs are very difficult to afford, compared to those in households earning more than that threshold. Even so, car owners in the lower income group are less likely to say that they could give up their cars than people in the higher income groups. Out of those that say that they find their vehicle related expenses difficult to afford, 12% of people in a household earning more than £20,000 a year say that they're likely or very likely to give up their vehicle, compared to just 6% of people in the lower income group. So we think this is demonstrating the lack of viable alternatives to the car in terms of public transport, for instance, for many people. So next slide, please. And excuse me, when we look at specific groups, we see particular challenges. So we know that there's a long-standing accessibility gap in terms of transport for disabled people. England's travel survey, we don't have one for Wales, but England's one shows that in 2024, disabled adults took 29% fewer trips on average than non-disabled people. For many disabled people, there's no other option but to run a car to gain access to mobility. But our survey shows that half of car owners with a disability, which limits them a lot, find their vehicle-related expenses difficult to afford, and that compares to 26% of those who don't have a disability. Where people find them very difficult to afford as opposed to fairly, the gulf's even wider. So over 5 times as many people whose disability limits them a lot. So 26% say that their vehicle-related expenses are very difficult for them to afford, compared to the rate amongst people without a disability, which is around 5%. For many, the car's not an option, and they're going to be relying on other means to get around. So in our survey, the proportion of disabled people who don't have access to a car is almost double that of people who are not disabled, so 20% versus 11%, meaning that they're more likely to be more reliant on public transport. And more than 4 times the proportion of people with a disability said that they were unable to take an essential journey in the 3 months to May 2025 because there wasn't a public transport option which met their needs, compared to the proportion of non-disabled people who said the same. So we're looking at 19% versus 4% there. And we heard from our engagement with stakeholders that infrastructure such as pavements, dropped curbs, safe crossings are often lacking, even though they're vital if disabled people are to be able to walk or wheel to their local services or their nearest bus or train station, for instance. So next slide, please. And there are also challenges for people living in rural areas. So across Great Britain, rural households spend £29.30 more per week on transport than urban households. And this is to do with things like longer distances to access daily essentials. An overwhelming majority of rural households rely on cars to get around. And they told us that they couldn't manage their daily activities without access to private vehicles. But twice the proportion of rural residents say that their vehicle-related expenses are very difficult to afford than urban residents. But even so, even despite that kind of unaffordability, the rate at which rural car owners say they would be able to give up their cars to reduce these expenses is much lower than for urban car owners. Next slide, please. And the evidence shows that the current state of transport in Wales places also a huge burden on health, with the dominance of the car leading to reduced health outcomes from air pollution, increased accidents and deaths from collisions with vehicles. Public Health Wales puts the number of deaths caused by air pollution in Wales at around 1,400 a year. And people living in deprived areas are more affected. Other evidence from elsewhere shows that children living in deprived areas are also more likely to be involved in collisions with cars as well. So next slide, please. Our survey also found that people on low incomes have different levels of travel access and different travel needs. So while that stat is often heard in kind of like public discourse, the 20% of people in Wales not having access to a car, that comes from the last census, widely quoted. But in our survey, a third of people with a household income of less than £20,000 a year tell us that they don't have access to a car. And while the car is the most used form of transport for around 63% of Welsh adults in our survey, the same is only true for about 50% of people with a low household income. People living in low-income households are much more likely to rely on walking as their main method of travel. More than 3 in 10, 31% who live in a low-income household say that they had mostly walked to get around in the 3 months to May 2025, compared to 23% of people in higher income households. And while bus patronage, bus use has been falling for a number of years in Wales, the bus is the main method of travel for 10% of people in low-income households in Wales, compared to just 5% of people in higher income households. By contrast, trains relied upon as a main method of transport for much lower proportions of people, and we didn't actually see a difference between income groups there. It was the main transport mode for 2% of people across income groups. And while rates of home working are on the increase, the evidence shows it's not an option for many people on low incomes. 62% of people in a low income household tell us that they never work from home, compared to just over 50% of people in a higher income household. The next slide, please. And the next one again. There's clearly a lot of work to be done to improve transport provision for people in poverty in Wales. And those climate imperatives really add to the urgency. So in terms of the plans that the Welsh Government has for transport, barring a few important exceptions, transport is largely devolved to the Welsh Government. And the Climate Change Committee is advising that it does have a large responsibility for reducing transport emissions. I'm not going to spend too long on their plans. There are a huge number of them, and if you look in the report, you'll find a significant section that we've kind of dedicated to summarising them. But briefly, it agrees with the Climate Change Committee's recommendations for emissions reductions, but it sets out its own priorities to achieve them. It says it will work to reduce travel demand by encouraging home working and bringing services closer to where people live. And it sets out its priorities for investment based on a sustainable travel hierarchy, where investments should prioritize walking and cycling, public transport, modal shift, then ultra low emissions vehicles like EVs, and then other polluting private cars down at the bottom of that hierarchy. So it's about, for the Welsh Government, it's about avoiding unnecessary travel, shifting travel to sustainable modes, and then improving things like vehicle efficiency as well. Importantly, it's been increasing its ambition to create its integrated public transport system across different modes of transport in Wales. And it wants to get to a place where timetables are integrated across bus and rail, and where people are able to use a single ticket to access the whole of the transport system. And we have seen some big developments. The remit for Transport for Wales has been increased over the last few years. The bus bill has been introduced into the Senedd, which will re-regulate the bus industry and give Welsh ministers control over the planning of local bus services. And it's introduced tests following the roads review to determine whether new road investment contributes to climate goals. So next slide, please. So opportunities and risks. So next slide. In light of the Welsh Government's plans, we think that given that many decisions are still needing to be made in the coming years about the exact form changes in transport will take, there is uncertainty about how much the changes will translate to opportunities to improve the lives of people in poverty in Wales, or potentially present risks to them and possibly increase hardship. So in terms of opportunities, we think that plans for transport, they could mean more access to work, goods and services. We know that people are missing out on essential journeys, and evidence from the National Survey shows that transport issues are often cited as a reason people find it difficult to find work. We think particularly investments in public transport and walking and wheeling routes really could alleviate some of these challenges. Broader ranges of services, especially bus routes, they really could reduce the exclusion of communities that are currently locked out of mobility. They could, if you invest in public transport sufficiently, it could lead to boosted incomes, improved physical and mental health. If people are able to get out and about and become more active in terms of active travel investment. And the quote on the right shows that for buses particularly, this is a live issue. This is a representative from the bus industry saying that there are real challenges in his area for buses moving through traffic in peak times. So there's a lot of work still to be done, a lot of opportunities to increase the opportunities for people. And in terms of reduced costs, it's clear that some of the transport plans that are coming down the line could achieve that. So in terms of public transport, the right investments could reduce fares for people on low incomes directly with affordable flat fares or specific discounts, and work to increase the usage of public transport. It could also allow reductions in ticket prices as fare income increases. We know that people on low incomes would benefit disproportionately from that because we've already seen they already rely on public transport at higher rates. When it comes to cars, many people on low incomes will continue to need to use private cars for work, for example, and targeted support to support people from transitioning to an EV, an electric vehicle, would mean that they could get the benefits of lower running costs. On the other hand, if you get public transport to the point that it becomes viable and attractive for current car owners, they would potentially be able to give up vehicles, meaning that they could eliminate the costs that come with owning a car. And we think that improvements to transport which allow people more freedom to travel mean that other costs could be reduced as well. So, for example, having the opportunity, the ability to travel to access larger supermarkets where prices are often cheaper, for instance. Next slide. Health outcomes could be improved by transport delivery. Supporting the EV transition is clearly going to improve air quality. Investments in public transport bring that benefit as well as potentially reducing car traffic. So we could see a reduced risk of collisions. Active travel investment, reductions in car traffic could bring secondary health benefits by giving people the ability, the confidence to be more active. Next slide, please. So while there are clearly massive opportunities in terms of transport work coming down the line, our work has pointed to some really significant risks depending on the exact shape of various transitions and investments in transport. So while the electric vehicle transition, it's being presented to governments in official advice as a major contributor to emissions reduction, the high upfront costs of EVs mean that people on low incomes are less likely to be able to benefit from them. They might be the last to benefit from them without targeted interventions. And any financial penalties which might begin to be introduced for polluting car owners would clearly fall more heavily on low-income drivers who are less able to switch to an electric car. So next slide, please. Again, we think that there are risks that failing to invest enough in modal shift could make it more difficult for people to access work or goods and services. With the electric car transition, there's expected actually to be an increase in car traffic, according to kind of projections from Climate Change Committee, Department for Transport, as people find it cheaper to drive. So that really could impede plans to get more people to use public transport. could lead to cuts in services or increased fares. So it really is crucial that the focus remains on investing in public transport and encouraging people out of cars. Next slide. So we identified in the work three groups of people who are at increased risk of missing out on the benefits of decarbonisation work, while they also face increased risks of being disadvantaged by it. So people with disabilities, people living in rural areas, and also low-income workers who will continue to need to use their private vehicles for work are at particular risk. Um, so we heard from our engagements with stakeholders that things like charging cables and active travel infrastructure could increase the difficulty that people with disabilities face when they're moving around if their needs aren't taken into account. Active travel spending is low in Wales compared to a number of other countries, including Scotland, where spending per head is much higher. Improving pavements and crossings is really critical to enabling disabled people to access mobility. And if public transport spending isn't sufficient, then we also might see the improvement. We also might not see the improvements to the accessibility of access that is clearly really needed. People with disabilities who need to use a car are likely to lose out of the benefits of electric vehicles if there's not further help to access them. We've seen quite a lot of evidence suggesting that the Motability scheme, for instance, it's not really sufficient for low-income disabled people. Many people need to use the allowances for other essentials. And the next slide. And we think there's a risk that investment doesn't sufficiently account for the needs of rural communities as well. If we don't see sufficient investments in services like Flexi, which is demand responsive bus services, rather than fixed routes, in rural areas, low-income residents could see increased and or continuing social exclusion. We also think, again, that many low-income residents will continue to need to use cars, and they'll need specific help to access EVs. And it's also true for low-income workers who need to drive to work, like home carers, who are unlikely to be able to benefit from EVs without further support. So next slide, please, Stefan. So in terms of the recommendations that we've developed, we've got two sets of recommendations which we've designed to ensure that transport policies make the most of their potential to reduce poverty and inequality whilst also meeting climate goals. So the first is a set of principles which the Welsh Government should adopt in delivering transport policy. The second is a set of options, indicative options for a different approach, which illustrate the types of practical policies which the Welsh Government should be thinking about following. So in terms of the principles on this page, we think number one for the Welsh Government is explicitly placing the needs of people on low incomes on an equal footing with meeting emissions targets and its ambitions for transport. It should be able to demonstrate that it's actively considered the impacts of transport decisions on poverty. It should ensure that it listens to the voices of people, all people facing disadvantage in Wales, as it develops its policies, and also ensure that it takes a whole system approach. So, for example, it's not enough to provide more bus routes. Safe and accessible routes to get to bus stops are also critical to achieve its aim. So that's improving pavements, improving connectivity between areas in towns. And finally, regardless of the potential for electric vehicle transition to meet carbon emissions, our evidence shows that modal shift, it really clearly holds the greater long-term benefits for people in Wales. So it really should ensure that it keeps its ambitions high on this. The next slide, please. So going along with those principles then, there are a range of policy practical approaches that the Welsh Government could take to make real progress on its ambitions for emissions and social justice. We think, number one, enough investment needs to be there in buses, given the potential for increasing access to transport for so many people on low incomes in Wales. There's been a huge amount invested in rail, which is brilliant, but buses are able to reach into communities which trains can't, and there are huge opportunities to make the bus bill a positive step if it's matched with adequate investment. It really should be looking to pump prime provision of more and better and affordable services to embed public transport habits. it should be looking to make fares more affordable. So while there are a number of concessionary schemes, they're not particularly well targeted at needs, and they notably leave out most working age people. We think there's an argument that a better system would introduce potentially flat, affordable fares across Wales as a minimum for buses. Um, there are novel measures that the Welsh Government could introduce to support the adoption of public transport habits. We've been impressed by some of the schemes elsewhere in the world. Amongst them is a scrappage scheme introduced in Barcelona, for instance, which gives free public transport in exchange for scrapping older polluting vehicles. Um, Sufficient funding should be put into active travel. Good walking and cycling routes are critical to enabling the Welsh Government's ambitions for modal shift. They provide the connections that people need to get to bus and train stops, and they encourage people to walk and cycle instead of using cars. So we think the Welsh Government should maintain ring-fenced spending for active travel and aim potentially to devote around 10% of its transport spending to it. We think that the Welsh Government could introduce schemes to help low-income workers who rely on cars to transition to electric vehicles. And we think the care sector could be a good place to start, working with employers to provide electric cars for care workers who often struggle to afford their work driving. On data, we think there's more work to do to ensure the voices of different communities are heard, given the concerns raised by stakeholders that we spoke to. We think engaging with people in spaces such as food banks and community hubs, for instance, to get a sense of transport needs in different areas would be a positive step, whilst getting information about unknown, unmet demand for transport could be helped potentially by expanding the role and investment in flexi bus services, for example, to kind of gauge demand. And finally, we think that Welsh Government should push for powers over key bits of the transport sector, which it doesn't control currently. So particularly rail infrastructure. We think more local control in Wales over the transport sector as a whole will have benefits in realising the Welsh Government's ambitions for improving it. And as we've seen, the stakes are really high for people in poverty. So diolch, that's it from me. You can find the full report on our website. There's a link there. So yeah, check it out if you can. And I'll hand back to Stefan.
Thanks, Joel. I hope others agree that it's a really interesting presentation. I think it gives a real insight, possibly, into some of the challenges that people are currently facing with regards to their travel, let alone some potential opportunities and risks with the transition. I've seen we've got a couple of questions already come into the Q&A box, so please keep them coming. Whilst people start adding theirs in, I did have one. I thought asking you myself, Joel, as you were talking there about whether anything surprised you from the survey data. Yeah, I know you would have done some literature review stuff and stuff before that, but was there anything that came out of that survey that took you by surprise?
Um, yeah, I think what the survey kind of confirms what we knew already about this, but the just the overwhelming dominance of the car is really striking. It's clear that it's relied upon by huge numbers of people, less so on people in low incomes, but still huge dominance. But even people who struggle to afford their cars are still really reluctant to give them up. And I think that really shows the urgency of providing sort of viable alternatives to the car, public transport and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and I think speaking personally, I think the thing that struck me was whilst maybe the Welsh Government is talking about reducing demand for travel, there may well be an argument that there's actually under traveling happening within people who are living in poverty, and actually a sign of success might be to see increase in traveling from some groups and a reduction in traveling from other groups. Maybe there's a nuance there, and that might be interesting to
Mm.
explore in future as well. Turning to some of the questions we've had come in. So we've got 5, 10 minutes, another 5, 10 minutes on these, so please keep them coming. And so I'll take a question from an anonymous attendee first, Joel, in terms of, yeah, touching on that thing around demand and the role of the cars. How much of a role do you think home working has to play in reducing emissions and reducing transport inequalities?
Yeah, home working is really interesting because it seems as if it's one of the areas where Welsh Government ambitions are actually pretty close, and one of the few areas, I guess, where we're probably pretty close to where Welsh Government wants to be already. Since the pandemic, home working has exploded as many people will be aware of. I think it does look like those habits are here to stay, really. Um, in terms of getting emissions down, it's interesting that it doesn't that kind of rise in home working doesn't seem to have achieved a reduction in car travel for whatever reason. So whether it's having the desired effect that when these plans were kind of put in place on emissions reductions is kind of questionable. Although I guess you could say maybe people would be driving more if it weren't for home working. But it does seem like that trajectory of car travel is on the up. But I think from our evidence in terms of people on low incomes, it's clear that home working has a limited benefit. We know that people on low incomes tend to have the types of jobs that where you have to travel to work. So unless we see a huge kind of change in the jobs market, in terms of which is not likely, then it's not likely to have that much of a benefit for people on low incomes in that sense.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. And I guess with kind of with the Bevan housing hat on, I think I've had concerns in the past that the presumption that more home working would be a way of reducing inequalities. I think there's a real risk that given the inequalities within our housing system, you could actually deepen inequalities because if people don't have the space at home to work, that pushes them out into sectors that require them to be there in person, and they, from as you touched on there, tend to be sectors with lower pay. So there's a real concern there, perhaps as well. There's a question here from Rhian Noble Phillips, who asks, should the Welsh Government require a link between development and the planning system and the provision of public transport and active travel opportunities? So I know that's not something that you've looked at specifically in this work, Joel, but that feels like something that kind of links and tallies with some of the other stuff that you come out through your work.
In terms of the rules around developments and the connections
Yes,
that they
yeah,
should have.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a really live issue. And we've seen, I think, historical developments haven't taken into account the need for buses to be able to get around the estates and developments, housing developments. And I think that is a really I think that is going to be a real challenge going forwards in terms of making sure that developers are taking that into account. I think some of the planning guidance that we've seen has been really positive in that regard. But I think the proof is going to be in the pudding in terms of how much that is really delivered on. But it's really important, especially with new developments. I mean, there's such a massive opportunity to kind of foreground and exemplify good 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 practice in terms of increasing connectivity. So I think we really should be taking advantage of that if we can, and the Welsh government should do all that it can to encourage that.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. There's a comment here then from Sean Evans from the Older People's Commissioner, saying that the Older People's Commissioner would be supportive, of course, for more investment in the bus network. Because as he points out, having a bus pass is no good if there's no bus. It doesn't matter if it's free or not, if it doesn't exist, and we know older people sometimes have to resort to using taxis to get to health appointments, etc. So that link between passes and fares, etc., and the availability of service, looking at the system in the round is something I know you've kind of touched on there as
Mm.
well. There's another question here from an anonymous attendee about whether there's different attitudes from younger people towards public transport. Now, I know the survey was you've looked at 16 to 24-year-olds, so not necessarily attitudes, but certainly in terms of the challenges they face. I remember that there's some stuff in the report, isn't there, to say that there are some particular things that come up for younger people.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to do more work on attitudes to public transport amongst young people. We don't have that much in terms of that. I mean, kind of across the board in terms of age, we saw that people generally regard in pretty significant numbers that public transport isn't sufficient in their area. There aren't the connections that they need and all of that stuff. I think younger people are a real opportunity for the Welsh Government in terms of foregrounding public transport availability and getting usage up because younger people are facing more and more challenges in terms of getting a car and learning to drive. Those costs are going up and up, and it's really expensive for young people to insure cars and all of that. So I think in terms of I don't know about the state of kind of how it's regarded, but if the Welsh government can crack that, if they can get younger people onto public transport, then you're setting up travel habits for years into the future, and they could also be contributing to the fare income that public transport is receiving as well. So I think it's a real opportunity.
Yeah, and I think touching on that, I think you mentioned in the report, didn't you, that the number of provisional licenses issued every year has fallen, and
It
that
seems that
is
way, although it's difficult to tell with COVID. That data is kind of messy, but it does seem that younger people are having more and more challenges getting into
yeah.
cars. I mean, the lessons are so expensive and the insurance is so expensive. I can see how it would be hugely, yeah, hugely discouraging for young people at this point to be looking at learning to drive.
Yeah. We've got another final couple of questions. So if anyone has any further questions, now is the time to raise them. So one was around touched on policies being developed elsewhere in the world. Do you want to talk a little bit more about some of those? I know there's a little section in the report where an annex in the report where you draw attention to a couple of those, but did you want the opportunity to just mention a little more on those?
Yeah. Yeah, so we've just got a couple of examples at the end of the report in terms of kind of good practice from other areas that we thought were really interesting and could potentially be looked at by the Welsh government to kind of emulate. One of them, as I mentioned, was I think it's called the T Verde card in Barcelona. And that's been going, I think, since 2017. And the way that it works is if you have is it's not specifically income kind of targeted or based, but if you have an older polluting vehicle, which a lot of people on low incomes are going to have older polluting vehicles, then you're able to give up that car, and then in return, the Barcelona authorities will give you a 3-year travel pass, which allows unlimited free travel in the network. And we thought that that was interesting because of the Welsh government's plans in terms of um, developing this integrated network. So the more integrated the Transport for Wales, what they're calling the T network becomes, the more opportunities there are to introduce schemes such as that. We thought maybe you could call it a T card or something like that. And potentially has limited low cost for the Welsh government as well in terms of doing that. It's not like a scrappage scheme where the government has to pay off car companies for the costs of new cars. It's potentially quite affordable, and anything that helps get people out of older vehicles is going to help emissions, whilst also potentially increasing opportunities for people who are struggling to get around as well. In terms of the other stuff we looked at in France, they've got a social leasing scheme that they've been running for a few years now. The French government is basically making it an option to lease electric vehicles for, I think the lowest kind of amount per month is about 49 euros, 49 to about 150 euros per month, which is massively cheap compared to kind of open market. And it's aimed at people on low incomes. I think given they've enabled around 50,000 people each year to have access to an electric car. It's something that is potentially quite expensive, but you could do something similar. The Welsh government could do something similar, engaging with car companies or engaging with employers to try and potentially subsidize and do something similar. Although it is something that we probably thought that the UK government would be more in a place to kind of pursue. But yeah, really interesting stuff from around the world. And I think it just shows that if Welsh government policy is kind of agile and thinking about the needs of people on low incomes, then there are really interesting things that could potentially happen.
Yeah, and I think there's a message there, isn't there, about needing to have a not one size fits all approach as well, isn't
Yeah,
there?
yeah, for sure.
For that idea from Barcelona could well be an option in parts of urban Wales. A leasing scheme could be more effective in rural Wales, where
Yeah.
getting people into public transport may well prove to be a challenge longer term. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. So apologies if we didn't get to your question. just want to say thank you to Joel for all his work and thank you to all of you for joining. We are hoping to carry on our work in this area as a foundation over the next few months. So if you're interested in talking to us, developing the idea a bit further, sharing your thoughts, please feel free to do so. We'd be delighted to hear from any of you. Other than that, that's all I've got to do is to say thank you very much, diolch yn fawr, and we'll see you all again very soon, hopefully.